Ethan Miller, a former journalism student turned gas station worker, sacrifices his dreams to care for his dying father. Struggling with debt and grief, he works the night shift, unnoticed by most. One cold night, Ethan defies strict rules to give a sandwich and jacket to a homeless man, whose quiet dignity haunts him. His manager, Carl, fires him for breaking protocol. But the next morning, military Humvees arrive, hinting at the old man's mysterious identity. Who was he? Why did Marines salute Ethan? A single act of kindness unravels a story that could change everything. If Ethan's story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share to support our channel. Join us for more inspiring tales that show the power of compassion. Your engagement helps us keep these stories alive. Let's spread kindness together. Check out grok.com or the X app to stay connected. The fluorescent lights of the bus station buzzed overhead, casting a pale, sterile glow over the cracked linoleum floor. Carl, the manager, stood behind the counter, his face twisted into a scowl that seemed permanently etched into his features. His voice cut through the quiet like a whip. "Did you give him food, Ethan?" he barked, his tone sharp enough to make Ethan's stomach lurch. Ethan's heart thudded against his ribcage, a frantic rhythm that echoed the anxiety coursing through him. Sweat beaded along his spine, prickling his skin under the thin fabric of his uniform. He nodded, unable to muster words, his throat tight with dread. Carl's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Then you're fired," he spat, the words landing like a physical blow. The small store fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator units in the background. Ethan stood frozen, his mind racing with a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. Fired? For giving a scrap of food to a man who looked like he hadn't eaten in days? His chest tightened, a mix of shame and defiance bubbling up inside him. He wanted to argue, to plead his case, but the words wouldn't come. The other employees avoided his gaze, their silence a heavy weight in the air. Only one pair of eyes met his, the old homeless man by the dumpster outside, barely visible through the smudged glass window. His gaze was weary, etched with a lifetime of hardship, yet there was a depth to it, like the endless expanse of the ocean, holding stories no one had ever bothered to ask about. Ethan felt a pang of connection, a fleeting moment of understanding that this man, dismissed by the world, carried a weight of experience that deserved to be heard. The next morning, the world seemed to shift on its axis. The quiet hum of the gas station lot was shattered by the low rumble of 6 military Humvees rolling in, their tires crunching against the gravel. Ethan, still reeling from the previous night's humiliation, watched from behind the counter as a Marine Corps officer stepped out of the lead vehicle. His uniform was pristine, the medals pinned to his chest glinting in the early sunlight, his boots striking the pavement with a deliberate, authoritative rhythm. The officer's presence commanded attention, his posture rigid with purpose. He scanned the lot briefly before his eyes locked onto Ethan. To Ethan's astonishment, the officer raised his hand in a crisp salute, not to a general, not to a dignitary, but to him, a 23-year-old gas station clerk in a faded polo shirt. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, confusion and awe swirling in his mind. Who was that old man by the dumpster? And what kind of person could inspire a battlefield hero to show such profound respect to someone as ordinary as Ethan Miller? Ethan's life had never been destined for the dim glow of a gas station's night shift. Growing up in a sleepy town just outside Orlando, Florida, he had been a dreamer with a notebook always tucked into his back pocket. As a boy, he'd wander the streets, scribbling down stories about the people he met. The baker who kneaded dough with hands weathered by years of work, the high school janitor who hummed old jazz tunes while mopping the floors. Ethan's curiosity was insatiable, his heart set on becoming a journalist, a voice for the voiceless, a storyteller for those whose lives went unnoticed. He'd lie awake at night, imagining his byline in a major newspaper, his words sparking change, his stories giving dignity to the overlooked. When he enrolled at the University of Florida, Ethan threw himself into his journalism classes with a fervor that bordered on obsession. He maintained a 3.9 GPA, pouring late nights into the student newspaper, chasing leads and crafting articles that earned praise from his professors. They saw in him a rare spark, a blend of empathy and tenacity that promised a bright future. His classmates teased him, saying he'd be the one they'd see on CNN within a decade, breaking stories that shaped the world. Ethan believed it too, his heart brimming with hope and ambition. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. In his junior year, the world Ethan knew began to crumble. His father, Mark, a man whose calloused hands could build a house from the ground up and whose booming laugh could light up a room, was diagnosed with ALS. The news hit Ethan like a freight train. Mark had always been his hero, a pillar of quiet strength who taught him how to ride a bike, how to stand up for what was right, how to love fiercely and without apology. Watching his father's body betray him, his once strong hands trembling, his steps faltering, was a slow, excruciating heartbreak. Ethan tried to hold it all together, racing between classes, late-night study sessions, and weekend trips home to help his mother care for his father. But the disease was relentless, and the trips grew longer, the calls more desperate. His grades slipped, his internships fell through, and the weight of responsibility pressed down harder with each passing day. Finally, Ethan made the gut-wrenching choice to leave school. He packed up his notebooks, his dreams of journalism, and returned home to be his father's caregiver. For 2 years, he became Mark's hands, his feet, his voice. He fed him, lifted him from bed to chair, and sat with him through the long, dark nights when pain and fear loomed large. Those moments, though agonizing, were also filled with a quiet, profound love, a bond that no disease could break. When Mark passed away, Ethan was left hollowed out, grieving not just his father, but the life he'd once envisioned. With no degree, mounting student debt, and a heart heavy with loss, he took the only job he could find, the night shift at a gas station on the edge of town. To the customers who passed through, Ethan was just another face behind the counter, a kid who never made it out, stuck in a dead-end job with no ambition. They didn't see the years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights spent caring for his father, the dreams he'd set aside for love. They didn't know about the notebook still tucked in his drawer at home, filled with half-written stories, or the ache in his chest when he thought of the life he'd almost had. Ethan's story was one of quiet resilience, of burdens carried without complaint, of heroism that didn't demand recognition. Like so many others, he was an unsung hero, his dreams deferred but not extinguished, flickering like a candle in the wind. That night, the Florida air was colder than usual, sharp enough to bite at Ethan's cheeks as he pushed open the gas station's back door, his shift over but his heart still heavy with the sting of being fired. He glanced at the dumpster where the old man had been, wondering about the stories those tired eyes held, and why a Marine officer had saluted him with such reverence. Ethan didn't know it yet, but that moment was the beginning of something new, a spark that would reignite the dreams he thought he'd lost forever. Under the dim, flickering glow of a gas station's lone street lamp, Ethan stood in the biting cold, his breath curling into fleeting clouds that dissolved into the night air. The chill seeped through his thin work jacket, but it wasn't the cold that made his heart race. It was the weight of a decision he hadn't expected to face. As he heaved a heavy trash bag into the rusted dumpster, a faint movement in the shadows caught his eye. His pulse quickened, not out of fear, but from a sudden, piercing awareness. There, pressed against the rough brick wall, was an elderly man, his frail body barely shielded from the winter's bite by layers of mismatched, threadbare clothing. His gray beard, tangled and matted, framed a face etched with lines of hardship. His shoes, barely holding together, were patched with strips of duct tape, and his trembling hands wrestled with a crumpled plastic bread bag he'd fished from the garbage. In the faint light, his eyes, clouded with exhaustion but sharp with desperation, were locked on the bag, as if those few stale crumbs inside were his only lifeline. Ethan stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. The man wasn't begging, wasn't shouting for attention or money. He was just there, existing in a quiet, desperate struggle to survive, clutching at scraps most would discard without a second thought. Ethan's mind churned with conflicting emotions, pity, guilt, and a gnawing sense of helplessness. He thought of the rules, the ones Carl, the gas station manager, had hammered into every employee's head with unyielding clarity. No handouts, no free coffee, we're not a charity. The warning echoed in Ethan's mind, along with the story of the coworker fired last year for slipping a sandwich to someone outside. It was a clear line, one Ethan had never dared to cross. But as he watched the old man's trembling fingers fumble with the bag, something deeper stirred within him, a quiet rebellion against the indifference he'd been taught to accept. This wasn't just a rule, this was a human being, hungry and cold, reduced to rummaging through trash for survival. Ethan's chest tightened with a mix of fear and resolve. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't seen anything, and keep his job secure. Or he could act, knowing full well the consequences. Without a word, Ethan turned and slipped back into the gas station, the bell above the door jingling softly as it closed behind him. The store was eerily quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator units and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. His heart pounded as he moved with purpose, his mind racing with the weight of his choice. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the rich, warm aroma filling the air as steam rose from the machine. From the deli case, he grabbed a turkey sandwich, carefully wrapping it in wax paper. Then, on impulse, he retrieved an old fleece jacket from his locker, a worn but warm piece of clothing he hadn't worn in months. Standing at the register, he rang up each item, his hands steady, but his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and determination. He swiped his own debit card, the beep of the transaction cutting through the silence, and tucked the receipt into his pocket like a secret. Stepping back into the cold, Ethan saw the old man still crouched against the wall, his fingers shaking as he tried to tear open the stubborn plastic bag. The sight tightened Ethan's throat, a mix of sorrow and urgency swelling within him. "Sir," he said softly, kneeling to the man's level, his voice barely above a whisper, "I thought you might want something warm." The old man's head snapped up, his weathered face a mixture of surprise and wariness. His eyes, sunken but sharp, flickered with a cautious hope, as if he couldn't quite believe the kindness being offered. "I can't pay you, son," he rasped, his voice rough but tinged with a quiet dignity. Ethan's heart ached at the words, at the shame he saw in the man's expression. "It's already taken care of," Ethan murmured, setting the coffee, sandwich, and jacket gently on the ground before stepping back to give the man space. In that small, quiet exchange, Ethan felt a shift deep within him. The world had taught him to look away, to walk past the homeless, the hungry, the forgotten, to scroll past their stories on his phone, to tell himself it wasn't his problem. But in that moment, he refused to let that numbness win. He didn't know it then, but his small act of defiance, his choice to see and to act, would set in motion a ripple that would change both their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The sharp jingle of keys shattered the quiet, announcing Carl Benson's arrival before Ethan even saw him. The silver BMW roared into the gas station lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a pair of cold, judgmental eyes. Ethan's stomach twisted, a wave of dread washing over him as Carl's heavy footsteps crunched across the gravel. The manager's presence was imposing, his broad frame and sharp gaze radiating authority. "Did you give him food?" Carl snapped, his voice slicing through the stillness like a blade. Ethan turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, sweat prickling down his back despite the frigid air. His throat felt dry, but he forced himself to meet Carl's gaze, nodding stiffly. "I paid for it myself," he said quickly, fumbling for the receipt in his pocket and holding it out like a shield. Carl snatched it, barely glancing at the crumpled paper before fixing Ethan with a hard stare. "We have rules for a reason, Ethan," he said, his tone clipped and unyielding. "You think you're doing him a favor, but all you're doing is turning this place into a magnet for every stray in the county." Ethan's jaw tightened, a spark of defiance flaring in his chest. He glanced at the old man, still clutching the coffee and sandwich, his eyes darting between Ethan and Carl with a mix of fear and gratitude. "He was just trying to eat, Carl," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Carl's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "That's not your call," he shot back. "You're here to run the register, not save the world." The words stung, sharp and dismissive, but Ethan stood his ground, his hands clenched at his sides. "I didn't do it to save the world," he said, his voice low but firm. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." For a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. Two opposing forces locked in a silent battle, one bound by rules and order, the other driven by a quiet, unshakable conviction. Ethan didn't know what would come next, whether he'd lose his job or spark something greater. But in that moment, he knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. In a fleeting moment, Carl's face betrayed a flicker of surprise, his eyes widening ever so slightly as Ethan's words hung in the air. But the shock vanished as swiftly as it came, replaced by the steely, practiced composure of a man who had long ago mastered the art of corporate control. "Well then, you're finished here," Carl said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth, as he tugged a termination form from the clipboard tucked under his arm. The paper crinkled faintly as he slid it across the counter. "Work the rest of your shift. Don't bother coming back." Without another word, Carl turned and strode away, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor, leaving Ethan standing there, alone with the weight of the moment. Ethan's hands trembled, a subtle quake he tried to hide by shoving them into the pockets of his work apron. His chest ached, a dull, heavy pressure that seemed to press against his ribs, as if his heart were straining under the burden of disappointment and fear. Losing this job, a grueling minimum wage gig at the gas station, wasn't just a blow to his bank account. It was a reminder of how precarious his life had become. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and his savings were already a thin thread stretched to breaking. Yet beneath the swirling anxiety, a quiet spark of resolve glowed faintly. Ethan had known the risk when he'd made his choice the night before. He'd weighed the consequences, staring into the potential fallout like a soldier sizing up a battlefield. And still, he'd acted. Now, as the sting of Carl's words settled in, Ethan felt no regret. The decision had been his, and it had been right. This wasn't the first time Ethan had seen the cold machinery of a place like this grind down anything resembling humanity. The gas station, like so many businesses, was bound by a web of policies and procedures, rules that wrapped around its core like barbed wire, choking out any room for compassion. Those rules kept the registers humming, the shelves stocked, and the waste low. They ensured managers like Carl could maintain their grip on order, their authority unquestioned. But they also fostered a kind of blindness, a moral haze that reduced employees to mere parts in a vast, unfeeling machine, one that prized efficiency above all else. Ethan didn't see Carl as a monster. He was just a man molded by years of training to view the world through spreadsheets and profit margins, to prioritize the bottom line over the beating hearts of those around him. Carl wasn't evil. He was obedient, a cog himself, polished and precise. But Ethan couldn't shake the belief that when rules smothered kindness, something vital slipped away. The ability to see the dignity in another person, to recognize their worth beyond their utility to the machine, that was what was at stake. Every time Ethan clocked in, he felt the tension between the demands of the beach and the quiet voice in his heart urging him to do better, to be better. Last night, that voice had won. As the hours of his final shift crawled by, Ethan moved through his tasks in silence, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. The old man's eyes, tired yet shimmering with a quiet gratitude, haunted him. They carried him through the monotony of mopping floors and restocking coolers, a reminder that his choice, though costly, had mattered. Even as his job slipped through his fingers like sand, Ethan's sense of rightness stood firm, unshaken. By mid-afternoon, Ethan was back in his cramped apartment, the weight of the night still clinging to him like damp clothes. He sat at the kitchen counter, a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, his laptop open to a job application portal that felt more like a maze than a lifeline. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, a constant reminder of the bills piling up. His phone, resting on the counter, had been quiet all morning, its screen dark and unassuming. When it suddenly buzzed, the sound jolted him, his heart skipping as he glanced at the unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the answer button, a mix of curiosity and dread swirling in his gut. Finally, he pressed it and brought the phone to his ear. "Hello, is this Ethan Miller?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional, with a hint of warmth that caught him off guard. "Yes, this is Ethan," he replied, his tone cautious, his mind racing to place the voice. "This is Monica Reyes with Veterans Affairs. I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes." Ethan's brow furrowed, confusion knitting his thoughts together. Veterans Affairs? He didn't have any connection to the military, no family members who'd served, no reason for a call like this. I "I think you might have the wrong person," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I don't believe so," Monica replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I understand you helped someone outside your workplace last night." Ethan's chest tightened, a sudden rush of memory flooding back. The old man by the dumpster, his frail frame shivering in the chilly night air, his hands clutching the sandwich and jacket Ethan had offered. Could this really be about him? "I didn't do much," Ethan murmured, almost to himself. He was cold, hungry. "I just gave him some food and an old jacket from the lost and found." There was a brief pause on the line, and when Monica spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Ethan's pulse quicken. "That act meant more than you know," she said. "The man you helped wasn't just someone passing through. He's someone our department has been trying to locate for months." Ethan's breath caught, his mind spinning. "Who is he?" asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd prefer to explain in person," Monica said. "Can you come to our Tampa office tomorrow morning?" As the call ended, Ethan set the phone down slowly, a strange mix of confusion, unease, and curiosity settling over him like a fog. He'd seen countless faces come and go outside the gas station, drifters with nowhere to go, runaways chasing dreams or fleeing nightmares, travelers down on their luck. But the old man had been different. There was something in his bearing, a quiet dignity that lingered in Ethan's memory, the way his eyes had met Ethan's, steady and grateful, the way he'd offered that crisp, almost instinctive salute before melting into the darkness. It stirred something deep in Ethan, a realization of how easy it was to overlook the people on the edges of society. Veterans, like so many others, passed through the world unnoticed, sitting on park benches, sleeping under overpasses, holding cardboard signs at busy intersections. Once they'd worn uniforms, carried the weight of duty and sacrifice. Now, too often, they carried only the weight of invisibility. The weight of duty had always carried a quiet pride, a badge worn not on the chest but in the heart. For those who served, it was a flame that never quite dimmed, even when the world moved on, leaving them to walk unnoticed among the clamor of everyday life. Their battles, whether fought on distant fields or within the silent confines of their own minds, were often drowned out by the hum of busy routines, forgotten by those who passed them by. Ethan Miller knew this truth intimately. His father's struggle with ALS had carved a deep wound in his soul, one that throbbed with every memory of the man who once stood tall, his voice strong and commanding, only to be silenced by a disease that stripped him of speech and stole the world's fleeting sympathy. Ethan had watched as friends and neighbors, once full of kind words and casseroles, drifted away when the illness became too heavy, too inconvenient. It left a bitterness in him, a quiet ache for the overlooked. That ache stirred again when Ethan thought of the old man at the gas station. He wasn't just another stranger, another face blurred by the monotony of Ethan's late-night shifts. No, this man carried a story, someone's father, someone's brother, someone who had once stood resolute until life, with its unrelenting cruelty, brought him low. Ethan could still see the man's weathered hands, the way they trembled slightly as he offered a salute in the dim glow of the mile station's fluorescent lights. That moment had felt small then, a fleeting exchange of kindness in the dead of night. But as the sun sank low, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson, Ethan felt a shift deep within him. What he had dismissed as a simple gesture was unfurling into something vast, something that would place him at the heart of a story far greater than himself. His chest tightened with a mix of awe and unease, as if the universe had just whispered his name. The morning broke open like a scene ripped from a blockbuster, vivid and surreal. Ethan had barely slept, his mind tangled in the strange phone call from Monica Reyes, the gas station's district manager. Her voice had been clipped, urgent, hinting at something monumental but offering no details. He sat at his kitchen table nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, trying to piece together the fragments of her words. His thoughts were a jumble, confusion, curiosity, and a nagging sense that his life was about to change. The rumble of engines snapped him out of his haze. Stepping onto his front porch, he froze as 6 Humvees rolled down his quiet suburban street, their tires grinding against the asphalt with a low, menacing growl. The sight was jarring, out of place in the sleepy Tampa neighborhood, where the most exciting event was usually a kid's bike race. Neighbors peeked through parted curtains, their faces a mix of suspicion and intrigue. A few bolder ones stepped onto their porches, phones already raised, capturing the convoy as it moved with purpose. The Humvees turned sharply, their destination unmistakable. The gas station where Ethan had worked his shift just hours ago. His heart thudded as he grabbed his jacket and jogged down the street, the morning air sharp against his skin. By the time he arrived, the gas station, a place of mundane transactions and spilled coffee, had transformed into a spectacle. The Humvees were parked with military precision, their hulking forms dominating the lot. Passers-by stood frozen, some mid-pump at the gas pumps, their eyes wide with disbelief as a unit of Marines filed out, their uniforms crisp, their movements synchronized. At the center stood Brigadier General Samuel Harris, a towering figure whose chest gleamed with rows of medals, each one a silent testament to battles fought and sacrifices made. His face was calm but resolute, his eyes scanning the scene with the quiet authority of someone who had seen the world's case and tamed it. The crowd was growing now, a buzzing mix of reporters, curious onlookers, and nervous gas station employees. Whispers swirled, speculation about what could have drawn such a force to a nondescript gas station in Tampa. Social media was already ablaze, Ethan's phone vibrating with notifications as videos of the Humvees and snapshots of the Marines flooded the internet. Hashtags like #GasStationHero and #MarinesInTampa were climbing the trends, turning a small moment into a viral phenomenon. Inside the store, General Harris stood with Monica Reyes and a handful of corporate executives, their suits stiff and their expressions tighter. The air was thick with anticipation, every glance and gesture heavy with unspoken meaning. When Ethan stepped inside, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, the general's gaze locked onto him. Those eyes were steady, kind, but carried a weight that made Ethan's breath catch. "You must be Ethan Miller," Harris said, extending a hand. Ethan shook it, his palm clammy, his mind racing to make sense of the moment. "Yes, sir," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm just a gas station attendant." The general's lips curved into a faint smile, one that held both warmth and wisdom. "Not today, son," he said softly. "Today, you're the man who helped bring one of our own home." Ethan's stomach lurched, a wave of emotion crashing over him. "Who was he asked, his voice thick with the weight of the question. Harris's expression softened, but his voice remained steady. "Major General Walter Green," he said. A decorated officer, retired after a traumatic brain injury left him struggling. He wandered from his care facility months ago. We searched tirelessly, posted alerts, scoured the area, but he slipped through the cracks. Until you. Ethan's throat tightened, his mind flashing back to the old man's quiet dignity, the way he'd stood straight despite his frail frame, the salute that had felt like a bridge across time. It all came rushing back, heavy with new meaning. He could still see the man's eyes, clouded but proud, and the way he'd faded into the night, leaving Ethan with nothing but a fleeting sense of connection. Harris continued, his voice firm yet laced with a quiet reverence. "We like to think systems save the world. Big organizations, policies, laws. But sometimes it's one person, one small act of kindness, when no one's watching, that cuts through all the noise. That's what you did, Ethan. You reminded us what it means to see someone, really see them, and act with humanity." Ethan's chest swelled, a mix of pride and humility washing over him. The store, once a backdrop to his endless shifts of stocking shelves and mopping floors, was now a stage for something extraordinary. The people who had once passed him by without a glance, customers, co-workers, were now watching him, their faces alight with awe and curiosity, their phones capturing every second. Ethan stood at the center of it all, his heart pounding, not just a gas station attendant, but a man who, in a single moment of compassion, had changed a life and sparked a ripple that would echo far beyond the fluorescent lights of that small Tampa store. Under the harsh glare of the midday sun, Ethan Miller stood by the gas station pump, his palms sweaty and his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The air was thick with the hum of a crowd that had gathered in a semicircle around him, their faces a mix of curiosity, admiration, and something Ethan couldn't quite place. Maybe hope. Just 24 hours ago, he'd been invisible, a night shift cashier at this rundown station, his existence barely registering with the bleary-eyed customers who shuffled in for cheap coffee or scratched off dreams in the form of lottery tickets. Now he was the reluctant center of a spectacle he could scarcely comprehend, surrounded by military flags snapping in the breeze, a makeshift podium bristling with microphones, and camera crews jostling for the perfect shot. Ethan's worn sneakers scuffed the asphalt as he shifted his weight, his mind swirling with disbelief. How had a single moment, a fleeting act of kindness, spiraled into this? Brigadier General Samuel Harris stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding, his uniform crisp and adorned with ribbons that gleamed under the sunlight. The crowd hushed as his voice boomed across the lot, steady and resonant, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. Ladies and gentlemen, today we gather to honor a kind of heroism that doesn't shout for attention. It's the kind that whispers in the quiet moments, when no one's watching, when the world doesn't care. Ethan Miller, a young man with no duty to act, no promise of reward, and at the risk of his own livelihood, chose to extend a hand to a stranger in need. That stranger, as it turns out, was Major General Walter Green, one of our nation's finest. But that's not why we're here. We're here because Ethan didn't know who he was helping, and he helped anyway. The crowd stirred, a ripple of soft gasps and approving nods passing through them. Ethan's face burned, his cheeks flushed with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. He ducked his head, wishing he could shrink into the pavement. Heroism? The word felt too big, too heavy for what he'd done. All he'd done was notice a man, old, shivering, his eyes hollow with hunger, huddled near the station's dumpster in the pre-dawn chill. Ethan had given him a sandwich from the deli case, a cup of coffee that was already going cold, and the jacket off his own back. It hadn't felt like a choice at the time, just something that needed doing. But that simple act had cost him his job. The manager hadn't taken kindly to giving away inventory, especially not to someone who looked like they couldn't pay. Ethan had walked home that morning, his breath fogging in the cold, wondering how he'd explain the firing to his dad, who was already stretched thin, working double shifts at the factory. Now General Harris was motioning for him to come forward, his eyes kind but expectant. The applause that erupted was like a thunderclap, so sudden and forceful that Ethan flinched, his pulse hammering in his ears. His legs felt like they were made of lead as he shuffled toward the podium, every step an effort against the weight of all those eyes on him. He caught snippets of faces in the crowd, a mother holding her kid's hand, an old man in a faded baseball cap, a teenager filming with her phone, and wondered what they saw when they looked at him. A hero? Or just a kid who'd made a dumb move and somehow ended up here? The general's hand was steady as he pinned a civilian service medal to Ethan's faded flannel shirt. The gold caught the light, a stark contrast to the frayed fabric, and Ethan stared at it, half expecting it to vanish like some kind of dream. The citation being read aloud washed over him in a blur of formal words: duty, compassion, sacrifice, none of which felt like they belonged to him. His mind was elsewhere, replaying that moment in the dark, the old man's hands trembling as he took the coffee, his voice cracked with gratitude. "God bless you, son," he'd said, and Ethan had mumbled something awkward, unsure how to respond. He hadn't known the man was a decorated general, hadn't known his name or his story. All he'd seen was someone who looked like they were carrying the weight of the world, and for a moment Ethan had wanted to lighten that load. Standing on the podium now, under the relentless click of camera shutters and the swell of applause, Ethan felt a strange disconnect. The world was making a fuss over something that had felt so small, so instinctive. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped to the microphone, his throat tight, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who he was," he quavered, his words nearly lost to the breeze. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet the crowd's gaze. "I didn't think what I did was anything special. I saw someone who looked cold, who looked like he hadn't eaten in a while, and I thought if that was me or my dad or someone I loved, I'd hope somebody would stop. I'd hope somebody would care." The crowd was silent for a heartbeat, then erupted again, their cheers louder than before. Ethan's chest ached with a mix of humility and something fiercer. Resolve, maybe. He was starting to understand that what he'd done wasn't just about one man, one moment. It was about something bigger, something that rippled outward in ways he couldn't have imagined. As he stepped back from the podium, his eyes scanned the crowd, and he found himself thinking about all the other quiet acts of kindness that went unnoticed every day. The nurse who stayed late to hold a patient's hand, the teacher who slipped a sandwich into a hungry kid's backpack, the neighbor who knocked on an elderly woman's door just to make sure she was okay. Those moments didn't come with medals or headlines, but they were the glue that held the world together, the invisible threads that kept it from unraveling. For Ethan, the realization was both humbling and profound. True heroism wasn't about grand gestures or public praise. It was about choosing to act when it was easier to walk away, about seeing the humanity in someone the world had taught you to ignore. As the cameras flashed and reporters shouted his name, Ethan felt a quiet determination settle in his bones. He hadn't just stumbled into a moment that went viral. He'd stumbled into a truth that would stay with him forever. That even the smallest acts of care could carry extraordinary power, could challenge the coldest systems, could remind everyone what it meant to be human. Across the lot, Carl Benson watched from the edge of the crowd, his hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his worn coat. He'd never been a man for ceremonies, never cared much for the pomp and circumstance of public displays. But today he'd come for Ethan, the kid who'd seen him when no one else had. Carl's heart was heavy with gratitude, but also with a quiet pride. He'd been Major General Walter Green once, a name that carried weight in military circles. But that night at the gas station, he'd just been a man down on his luck, invisible to the world. Ethan's kindness had reminded him of something he'd lost along the way, that even in the darkest moments, a single act of decency could light the way forward. As he watched Ethan stand tall under the weight of the crowd's admiration, Carl knew he'd carry that moment with him always, a reminder that compassion could rewrite even the most rigid rules, could change the course of a life, could make the world a little less cold. Carl had always been a man of order, the kind who believed that a well-run gas station was a fortress against the chaos of the world. For years, he managed his little corner store with the precision of a military operation. Every pump gleamed, every shelf was meticulously stocked, and every employee followed his rules to the letter. To Carl, kindness was a luxury that could unravel the tight ship he ran. He took pride in meeting quotas, hitting sales targets, and ensuring no one, customer or employee, cut corners. Sentimentality in his mind was a weakness, a crack in the foundation of a business that thrived on efficiency. But deep down, beneath the starched collar and the polished shoes, Carl carried a quiet fear that letting his guard down even for a moment would make him vulnerable, less in control. Then came the day that changed everything. The Humvees had rolled out of town, their engines fading into the distance, and the media frenzy that followed left Carl standing alone in his near-empty store. The headlines had screamed about Ethan, the young employee Carl had fired without a second thought. Ethan had been caught giving free coffee to a struggling veteran, a small act of compassion that violated Carl's rigid policies. At the time, Carl hadn't hesitated. Rules were rules. But now, as he stood in the silence of the store, staring at the coffee machine where Ethan used to work, he felt a weight settle in his chest. Customers lingered longer now, their whispers filling the air with stories of the kid who'd made a difference. For the first time in years, Carl felt something he couldn't ignore. A gnawing, unfamiliar shame. He had dismissed a man for helping someone, and he hadn't even bothered to ask why. The realization stung, sharp and unrelenting, like a splinter lodged in his conscience. The shame followed Carl like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing day. He couldn't shake the image of Ethan's face, calm but resolute, as he'd packed his things and left. Carl had always prided himself on being decisive, but now he wondered if he'd been too quick to judge, too rigid to see the bigger picture. The gas station chain, sensing the public's reaction, had partnered with a local veteran center to rebrand the store as Patriot Stop, a place meant to honor those who served. It was a public relations move, but for Carl, it was a mirror held up to his own failings. He knew he had to do something, not for the cameras or the headlines, but for himself. He needed to face Ethan. The first time Carl walked into the Veteran Center, he felt like a stranger in a foreign land. His pressed button-down shirt and polished shoes stood out starkly against the relaxed crowd of veterans who laughed and shared stories over steaming cups of free coffee. The air smelled of roasted beans and camaraderie, and Carl's heart thudded with unease. He spotted Ethan across the room, sorting supplies at a folding table, his movements steady and purposeful. When their eyes met, Carl's instinct was to turn and flee, to retreat to the safety of his orderly world. But something held him in place, a flicker of resolve, a need to make things right. He approached, his throat tight, his palms clammy. Ethan, Carl began, clearing his throat, his voice betraying his discomfort. I was wondering if you could use another pair of hands around here. The words felt clumsy, inadequate, but they were all he had. Ethan looked up, his gaze steady and unreadable. There was no anger in his eyes, no smugness, just a quiet strength that made Carl feel small. For a moment he braced himself for rejection, certain he deserved it. But Ethan only nodded, his voice soft but firm. Sure, Carl, we can always use the help. At first, Carl was out of his element. He fumbled with folding chairs, nearly toppling a stack as he tried to arrange them. He overfilled coffee cups, leaving puddles on the counter, and his attempts at small talk were stiff, overly formal. The veterans, with their easy banter and shared history, seemed to speak a language Carl didn't understand. He felt like an outsider, a man who'd spent so long enforcing rules that he'd forgotten how to connect. But he kept coming back, week after week, driven by a quiet determination to prove he was more than the man who'd fired Ethan. Over time, something began to shift. Carl started to listen, really listen, to the veterans' stories. There was Tom, who spoke of his daughter's graduation with a pride that made his eyes shine. Maria, who shared tales of her deployments with a mix of humor and pain. And James, who quietly admitted he still woke up to nightmares, but found solace in the center's community. Carl learned their names, their quirks, their struggles. He began to see them not as customers or numbers, but as people. People who'd sacrificed, who'd carried burdens he could scarcely imagine. And in their stories, he saw Ethan's quiet wisdom, the understanding that had guided the young man's actions all along. People mattered more than policies. Carl's apologies weren't grand gestures or eloquent speeches. They came in small, deliberate acts. He stayed late to sweep the floors, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up. He drove a veteran to a doctor's appointment, listening patiently as the man recounted his fears about an upcoming surgery. He showed up day after day, not because anyone was watching, but because he felt a pull he couldn't explain. Each act was a step toward redemption, a way to mend the rift he'd created. And slowly he began to feel something new, a warmth, a sense of purpose that no sales target had ever given him. The transformation of the gas station itself was nothing short of extraordinary. Once a forgettable pit stop for hurried commuters, Patriot Stop had become a beacon of community. Bright banners fluttered above the entrance, proclaiming its new mission. A bold sign welcomed veterans with the promise of free coffee, and inside a corner had been transformed into a cozy lounge. Comfortable chairs invited lingering, and military service flags adorned the walls, each one a silent tribute to sacrifice. A bookshelf, stocked with donated novels, stood proudly, offering a quiet escape for those who needed it. The store, once sterile and transactional, now hummed with life, a place where stories were shared and connections were forged. For Carl, the journey was far from over. Personal growth, he realized, wasn't a single moment of clarity, but a series of small, awkward steps. It was choosing to show up when it would have been easier to stay away. It was listening when pride urged him to speak. It was admitting he'd been wrong, not with words, but with actions, day after day, cup of coffee after cup of coffee. Redemption, like heroism, didn't always come with fanfare. It happened in the quiet moments, in the choice to keep going, to rebuild trust, to rediscover the humanity he'd buried beneath rules and routines. And as Carl stood in Patriot Stop, pouring coffee for a veteran with a shy smile, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of belonging, a flicker of pride in who he was becoming. The gas station, once a nondescript pit stop off Route 17, had undergone a remarkable transformation. Gone were the sterile walls and flickering fluorescent lights. In their place, vibrant murals painted by local artists adorned the interior, depicting scenes of military valor and small-town resilience. Shelves once stocked with generic snacks now held books on military history and stacks of local newspapers, their pages brimming with stories of community triumphs and struggles. A sturdy bulletin board stood proudly near the entrance, covered in flyers advertising job fairs for veterans, counseling services tailored to those who'd served, and upcoming events to honor local heroes. But the true shift wasn't in the decor. It was in the heartbeat of the place, a quiet but undeniable pulse of connection that hadn't been there before. Customers no longer breezed through with their heads down, focused solely on filling their tanks or grabbing a quick coffee. They lingered now, their footsteps slower, their eyes catching on the faces of strangers who felt less like passers-by and more like neighbors. Regulars, once content to nod politely and move on, now struck up conversations with veterans they might have ignored in the past. There was Carl Benson, a retired mechanic with a gruff exterior but a heart soft as clay, who'd spent years coming in for his daily pack of smokes without a word to anyone. Now he was a fixture at the station, his laughter booming as he swapped stories with a young Army vet about their shared love of old cars. Carl's chest swelled with a quiet pride he hadn't felt in years, a sense that he was part of something bigger than himself. He'd even started volunteering, organizing donation drives for winter coats and care packages stuffed with handwritten notes of gratitude. For Carl, the gas station wasn't just a convenience store anymore. It was a lifeline, a place where he could give back and feel seen. The station had evolved into more than a business. It was a sanctuary, a gathering spot where people from all walks of life could pause and remember what it meant to belong. It stood as a testament to a simple truth. No one should fade into the background, unnoticed or unvalued. At the center of this quiet revolution was Ethan Miller, a man whose life had been forever altered by a single, unassuming choice. Ethan, with his tired eyes and calloused hands, had once felt like he was drifting through life, his dreams of journalism buried under years of odd mom and sleepless nights. But now, after the flurry of media coverage had quieted and the applause had faded to a distant echo, Ethan stood at a crossroads. For the first time in what felt like forever, opportunities stretched out before him like open roads. Job offers had flooded in, some from slick corporations eager to capitalize on his fleeting fame, others from nonprofits genuinely moved by his story and hungry for his perspective. Each letter, each email, carried a promise of stability, a chance to step into a new chapter. But Ethan's heart tugged him elsewhere, toward a path that felt less like ambition and more like purpose. With the support of a scholarship fund cobbled together by the community, donations from neighbors, small businesses, even kids who'd emptied their piggy banks, Ethan enrolled in college to finish his journalism degree. The decision wasn't easy. Doubt gnawed at him, whispering that he was too old, too far behind, too broken by life's detours to start over. But every time he stepped into the classroom, his pulse quickened with a mix of fear and exhilaration, a reminder that he was finally chasing the dream he'd tucked away so long ago. Yet, even as he dove into his studies, Ethan refused to turn his back on the gas station that had changed his life. He took on a part-time role, overseeing the veteran outreach program that had blossomed from his initial act of kindness. The work filled him with a quiet joy, a sense that he was honoring not just the veterans he served, but also the part of himself that had always believed in doing right by others. Ethan threw himself into the program with a fervor that surprised even him. He organized events at what was now called Patriots Stop, barbecues where families laughed under string lights, job workshops where veterans polished their resumes, and quiet evenings where old soldiers shared stories over steaming mugs of coffee. He worked tirelessly to connect veterans with resources, from mental health services to housing assistance, his heart aching for those who'd returned home only to feel lost in a world that didn't seem to notice them. In his spare moments, Ethan launched a blog, pouring his soul into stories about the people he met. He wrote about the Marine who'd built a new life after years of homelessness, the Vietnam vet whose hands still shook, but whose laughter was unshakable, the young reservist who dreamed of opening her own garage. Each post was a labor of love, a way to amplify voices that too often faded into silence. Journalism, Ethan discovered, wasn't about chasing scoops or seeing his name in bold print. It was about listening with his whole heart, about shining a light on the resilience and humanity of ordinary people. Every story he shared felt like a small act of connection, a way to remind the world that compassion could bridge even the widest divides. The impact of Patriot's Stop didn't stop at its walls. Like a gentle ripple spreading across a still pond, its influence touched other corners of the town. The diner on Elm Street, run by a no-nonsense couple who'd seen their share of hard times, started offering veterans a free coffee with every meal, a gesture that sparked smiles and stories from grizzled regulars. A barbershop 2 blocks away, its red and white pole spinning lazily, began hosting free haircut days for former service members. The clippers began humming as barbers listened to tales of far-off places and hard-won battles. The town was stirring, its people slowly realizing that kindness didn't need to be a fleeting moment splashed across a news ticker. It could be a quiet, steady thread woven into the everyday fabric of their lives. Discounts offered without fanfare, doors held open a little longer, conversations that left both sides feeling a little less alone. Ethan, standing behind the counter of Patriot's Stop one chilly evening, felt the weight of this change settle over him like a warm blanket. He watched as a young Marine, barely out of his teens, shared a joke with an elderly Vietnam veteran, their laughter mingling with the scent of fresh coffee. The Marine's shoulders, usually hunched with the weight of unspoken fears, relaxed as the older man clapped him on the back, his eyes crinkling with pride. Ethan's throat tightened, a mix of awe and gratitude swelling in his chest. He thought back to that single moment of kindness, that split-second choice to reach out to a stranger when the world had turned away. It had been about dignity, about seeing someone's worth when they'd been overlooked. And now that moment had grown into something bigger, something lasting, a movement built not on grand speeches or viral fame, but on the stubborn, everyday commitment to show up, to care, to keep the spark alive. Ethan's come to understand that true kindness wasn't about one-off gestures or fleeting moments of feel-good. It was about building systems, about creating spaces where empathy wasn't the exception but the rule, where helping one another was as natural as breathing. In a world that often felt fractured, where cynicism and indifference could weigh heavy, Patriot's Stop was proof that change was possible. It wasn't take a headline or $1 million, just one person willing to act, and a community willing to carry it forward. As Ethan watched the two veterans laugh, he felt a quiet truth take root in his one simple act had been the spark. But it was the collective effort, the volunteers, the neighbors, the strangers who'd become friends, that kept the flame burning. The story of Ethan Miller and Patriot's Stop was a reminder that the smallest acts could leave the deepest footprints. In a fast-moving, often divided America, where headlines screamed division and distractions pulled at every direction, it was the quiet choices that revealed the soul of a community. Ethan's decision to help a stranger had been about more than a single moment. It had been about restoring dignity, about refusing to let someone's humanity slip through the cracks. That lesson felt urgent, a call to push back against the rush of apathy, to remind everyone that goodness still had a place. Whether it was lending a hand to a neighbor, speaking up for what was right, standing up for what was right, or simply pausing to listen in a world that raced by, every act of kindness mattered. As Ethan's journey unfolded, it challenged everyone to reflect on their own choices. What would you have done in his place, faced with a moment where compassion called? When was the last time you reached out to someone in need, not for recognition or reward, but simply because your heart said it was right? Those questions hung in the air, quiet but insistent, inviting everyone to consider the ripples they could spark in their own lives. Ethan's story wasn't just about a gas station or a veteran. It was about the power of showing up, of choosing kindness in a world that sometimes forgot how. And in that choice, it held the promise of something enduring, the chance to weave a world a little kinder, one quiet act at a time.